Adrian's just introduced me, so I'm Luke. As you can see, I'm sociology. As you saw from the previous page, my research specialty is performance and image-enhancing drugs, looking at the subcultures that use these and the market in them. So learning outcomes, just really basic, as you can see, understand the sociological context of the use of performance and image-enhancing drugs, and getting some understanding of how the market in these operates. So I just wanted to start with a bit of history going through them. Now, primarily what we're going to be focusing on are the anabolic androgenic steroids, which is what most people think if you say performance and image-enhancing drugs. But just coming through history, there are quite a lot of different types. So it starts off with the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, who would drink wine and use strychnine to enhance performance, both in the ancient Olympic Games and in the gladiatorial contests. And then in the early 19th century, we get the first real use of performance enhancers as we see them in modern sports. So there are sort of endurance walking races, endurance cycle races. Starts off people using things like laudanum, which is opium, people using cocaine, different methods, either dulling pain or having stimulant properties. And this eventually develops with the development of amphetamines in 1889, I think it is. They start to become a common feature in cycling right up until we see the development of these, which is going to be our focus, anabolic steroids. And they really become big in about the late 50s, early 60s, when the US and USSR both start trying to develop different drugs to give their athletes a real performance edge. But as you can see, I've noted there is a spectrum of legality. So on the high end, we've got amphetamine, methamphetamine, stimulants which really improve performance in cycling, baseball, basketball, all sorts of sports, and were very widely used up until about the 1960s, and still there's some usage going on these days, although less now. There's obviously more drug testing, and these drugs are quite easy to detect. But just so you've got an idea of what's really encompassed in the whole performance enhancement sphere, drugs such as creatine, you can just buy over the counter. A lot of the protein shakes, which they just sell in any generic store, they contain it. It is a performance enhancer, has similar effects to steroids, although it's milder. But just to give you an idea, so there are some that are just completely legal and anyone can purchase, and going right the way up to Class B and even Class A in the case of methamphetamine. So my research, this is just an idea of how it's being conducted. It's all based on qualitative interviewing. It's not been like a longitudinal study or anything. It's just I've been going to gyms, hanging out, meeting people, seeing people talk to me, and some people have agreed to do interviews. Some others I've just got their entries. That's fine. So yeah, the method is snowballing. Obviously, you meet people in the gym. If they use, great, I'll interview them, but they might be able to introduce me to someone else. So very much it's trying to immerse, I suppose, in the subculture, which was kind of the Chicago school methodology employed in the 20s and ever since. And just to note, I've got some perceptions from within the subcultures, the people who are actually using, and also from the fringes, people who are on the edge, personal trainers, gym owners, and guys who just train in gyms but don't actually use. So it covers quite a range of things. So there's two types, obviously. You can go from main performance and image enhancing, and people use for different reasons depending on what they're training for. So we find performance athletes very much have different motivations to image-based athletes, and the means of acquiring them also vary a bit. But primarily it's on the motivations that it changes. So in terms of performance, the first thing I wanted to cover is this idea of whether or not performance enhancing use is necessarily cheating in sports. I don't know if anyone saw the Lance Armstrong documentary last night. That was David Walsh, who I've referenced there. He was one of the people talking in that. But just how you see in some sports, it's very much considered it's against the rules, and anyone who uses is a cheat, and anyone who uses is a fraud. And then you get to kind of these areas, powerlifting and wrestling, which should be the one on the end, wherein drugs aren't actually banned. There's no form of prohibition within the federations, and whether that constitutes cheating. And you'll find there's kind of different opinions on that. So a good example I use is when I was in the gym just lifting, and there was a young guy, about 17, 18, lifting near me, lifting quite a lot of weight, at very low body weight, and I said to him, have you thought about competing? There's a BFPA, which is powerlifting competition coming up. And he says to me, is that tested? Is that drug tested? And I said yes, and his response was, good, I don't want to go up against cheaters. Whereas of course, if the federation wasn't tested, how would they be cheating if they're not breaking the rules? So it's interesting, some people, such as him, will think no matter what you're doing, even if the sport allows it, you must be a cheater. Because as we can see, Marius at the bottom here says, nothing I do is tested, so I'm not breaking any rules. And what we'll see on the performance side is very much this view at the bottom. That's what they generally accept. So the first thing we see with performance-based athletes, one of the primary reasons why people start using is comparison to the performance of others. So what we have is a couple of quotes. One's from Guy Jim, who's a powerlifter. The other one's also a powerlifter. And the first one says, people who started using steroids were lifting a lot more weights in a short period of time, being a lot more competitive, and just giving the edge. And that was really his motivation, was he was trying to compete in the same sport as these guys. He was seeing the gains these guys were making, how much their performance was improving by, and he just said, yeah, I want to get in on that. Given he's competing in a sport where there's no drug testing, those guys are doing it legitimately, he just said, yeah, I want to get up to that level. So that was almost part of the dedication to the sport, is using these drugs in these types of sports. And likewise, Rich, who's the other powerlifter I spoke to, said, I'm not the only one who saw that and thought they're really likely to get on steroids. So for performance athletes, definitely one of the early things we see, especially with the powerlifters and the bodybuilders, are just they see the level you can achieve with steroids, they want to be competitive, so they say, yeah, okay, I'm going to get on that as well. The next point is general health, allowing people to train. There are guys who just use for health reasons, and the first guy I quoted is Chris, who's a Brazilian jiu-jitsu fighter. He's talking about mixed martial arts fighters, and he says they train 8 hours a day, and your body just can't keep up with that. He says you're pushing your body to the limit, and it's actually going to be healthier for you to inject testosterone, take red blood cells. And a few people involved in sort of the UFC have agreed with that as well. Dana White made a comment about how guys who go in the training camps who are on testosterone, it's so much easier for them, they repair really easily. And he's anti-steroids. He's introduced drug testing in UFC, but he still acknowledges, actually from a health perspective, if you are going through these brutal training camps, being on testosterone does help you. It does kind of give you an edge. Joe Rogan likewise has commented, because normally at the end of a training camp, guys' testosterone levels are completely crashed. It can actually hinder their performance because they've done so much, they've overtrained, whereas if you're on testosterone, you don't get that drop-off, so it just allows them to train as hard as they want to be competitive. And likewise, Marius, who's a wrestler, he commented that they don't have an off-season in wrestling, you just can't recover, and he tries to get enough sleep in and so on, but there's only so much your body can do naturally. And likewise, here's a guy, he does mixed martial arts fighting, wrestling proper, and then he also does the professional wrestling type thing, as you see this being in America with the Rock and so on. So he says very much, he has to have the image, he has to look really imposing for the latter, but because he's doing the serious training and he's training 7 days a week, and sometimes peak season he's competing in the professional wrestling side 5 nights a week, he says you couldn't possibly do this if you weren't on steroids, and that's how he makes his living. So and just kind of from that general health and being able to perform, come into the idea of guys who are using for injury repair and rehabilitation, which is something I didn't really know about coming into this research. I just thought people are using it to get big, get strong. But apparently a lot of guys, if they're suffering from injuries, they find it really helps them to be able to take something, and it does. So the first guy I quoted was Rich, the powerlifter, and he was saying he had a really bad shoulder injury, and he had heard that Boldenone, this steroid, which is actually a horse steroid, but people use them, he said he had heard that can really help with injuries, and he said he was injecting it for 3 weeks, and this shoulder injury, rotator cuff injury, just repaired in that time. I don't know if anyone's had one of those, but these literally can take a year or so to heal. And But I mean, he does acknowledge maybe it was a bit of placebo effect, and maybe it just killed the pain. The actual injury was still there, and maybe it didn't hurt him anymore, or he had the drive to power through it. But I also got a quote from a chiropractor who deals specifically in sports injuries, and he says, at the end of the day, growing is the same as repairing. It's the exact same physiological process. So if you're taking something to help you grow, naturally it's going to help you repair. And he says, from his perspective, dealing with a lot of sports people, he notices the ones on steroids, you can always tell because they repair so much faster than a normal person can. So it's interesting, there's a lot of health reasons to be using steroids, and this does affect people's decision. And quite a few of the performance athletes I spoke to, even if it wasn't their primary reason for going on, they still note that effect and say that was another factor which I considered. Even if they just wanted to be stronger or faster or whatever, they'll still say being able to repair was very important to them. And just kind of continuing on that, this idea that you can self-medicate for a health condition with these drugs. We see in recreational drugs, people drinking alcohol to help with anxiety, people taking benzodiazepines or opiates to deal with depression, and so on. You can see kind of parallels with people using performance enhancers to deal with conditions that maybe the doctors won't help them with. And one of my respondents, named Rose, she's a hypermobility syndrome sufferer, quite a serious condition really. Her ligaments are all very damaged. She went to the doctors and they would only prescribe her opiates. They started off, they gave her codeine and then onto tramadol, and then they were going to give her morphine sulfate, which she said just makes her like a zombie and she can't do anything, she's not functional. And her exact words were, they wanted me to be a state-sponsored smackhead. And she went online, or her friend went online for her, and found out that there has been research into human growth hormone for repairing ligaments, and it's been very successful. So she went to her doctor and said, can you prescribe me human growth hormone? And they said, no, we don't prescribe that, that's not for your condition, we won't give you that. So she goes online, orders illicit growth hormone from China, gets it sent here, and she says she was using it for a couple of months, and I have got the quote. She says it made differences that literally physiotherapists looked at me and have gone, you shouldn't be able to walk, how the hell are you able to do those things being powerlifting and dancing, which she hadn't been able to do for years, was suddenly able to do these things because of this drug they refused to prescribe her, but clearly worked. So that's just, I suppose that's the most extreme example of people using them for repair, and that's perhaps, I would consider that even if you were to consider use in sports, cheating under any circumstances, I think everybody would agree that that's quite a justified thing for her to be doing. So, and perhaps a grey area in morality. So that's why people use for performance and for general health. Next thing I wanted to cover was why people use for image purposes. As I said, that's the other branch. So, I mean, the first thing to look at is insecurity, whether people aren't very confident and they want to look or feel a certain way, and whether that's young men who are intimidated by like bigger guys and feel threatened and want to just be more confident, or whether there's some sexual thing they think they'll be more likely to get girls or whatever. There's possibly a variety of reasons a psychologist would be more inclined to explain. But just so I've got a few quotes. First one's JP, who's just a gym user, just training for how he looks. And he says, if there was an instant diet pill you could take and be skinny, then the whole world would want this. And people were telling me, you can take this pill and be muscly. And he said, yeah, of course I want that. I want to be able to say, look at me, look at my body. So that's the first example. And then the next one is Simon, who's another fellow gym user, just training for how he looks. And he says he does steroids just because it makes him feel more confident. He just feels he can go up to anyone and talk to anyone, and he feels comfortable. And he used to have a lot of insecurities. He's quite a small guy, but now he doesn't have those problems. So again, coming back to therapeutic use, maybe he's compensating for a psychological disorder, anxiety, and so on. So again, what we're seeing is, even though they are very different focuses, people training for performance, people training for image, we do see overlaps. And an interesting one is, so we saw from the two powerlifters at the start, they were training because they saw the guys around them making really good gains and they wanted to keep up. And on the image side, it's similar. So JP says, when you got your friends and stuff around you and you can see the gains they're making, you're just blinded. I was just going with what the other lads were telling me. I didn't know about steroids. I didn't research them. He just took what his friends were taking. And very much kind of a peer subculture, wherein if there's a group, in this case I think there were 6 or 7 of them, and 1 or 2 got on steroids, and then all the others saw the progress and really wanted to become a part of that, and it just blew into this entire group. And a personal trainer I spoke to, named Mark, he says he was training youngsters, so guys sort of 16 to, 20, and he says he finds they're a lot more influenced by things like steroids and things like they'll look up to a bloke in the gym and they want to do whatever he's doing to get those arms. So they'll see a big bodybuilder and they'll say, what are you doing? And if he's an honest guy, he'll say, I'm on testosterone, I'm on Depot. And literally that becomes the goal for them. They want to look like that, so they want to do whatever he's doing. So a lot of social influence we're finding. I just wanted to compare that sort of to Jock Young's take on cannabis use, how people don't go from being non-users straight into users. There's a kind of learned process, and there's a becoming a part of the social group, and then you learn how to use it and how to progress. And we seem to see a similar thing with regards to performance enhancers. But as I was saying about confidence, there's also the idea of necessity of work. So one of the guys I spoke to said he started working the doors when he was 17, and the other guy said, you need to get bigger, try some of this, steroids. So he started using it just for his job. So he was working the doors, he wasn't big enough, he didn't look intimidating enough, he started using it purely for financial reasons. And likewise, Mark, the personal trainer I quoted earlier, he's a natural trainer, but he comments on how a lot of the trainers in the gym use steroids, and he notices it does hurt his finances because they all advertise themselves with pictures, they show their bodies. He says you've got a huge muscular guy who's really ripped versus him, he looks good, but he's natural, so he can only look so big and so ripped. And people who maybe aren't aware of steroids and their exact effects and what's natural and what's not will come in and see, well, this guy's much bigger, he's much leaner, that's what I want to look like, and they'll go with that trainer. So he says, from a perspective of someone who's personal training, it can hurt your finances if you're not using when other people are. And there's maybe a bit of a prisoner's dilemma going on in there, where if nobody used, maybe they would all be better off, but as soon as one person does, really everyone has the motivation to. And likewise, this applies to fitness models and or any kind of area where it's competitive to be in better shape than another. So that's just an overview of why people start to use. And the next thing I was going to address is how people actually access the drugs, how they come across them. I presume you guys have all gone through social supply in some context, have you? Yeah? Okay, that's good. So very much we see a similar thing, people buying from either friends or friends of friends. As I said with JP and his peer group, there's 6 or 7 of them, a couple of them got on and they bought from the others. And yeah, there's sort of Taylor and Potter and whoever have done the same research on club drugs, MDMA and so on. It's very much guys are buying from people who they know, they feel more comfortable. So I've got a couple of quotes regarding that. So first was JP, who was the guy I quoted earlier, and he says, you're going through your friend and you think your friend won't hurt you or your friend's not going to put you in any danger. And again, there's really strongly parallels. People buying cannabis, people buying MDMA, it's they want to go through someone they can trust. And that seems to be the primary means of transaction throughout all the drug world, and well, not all, but the vast majority of drugs, and it seems to apply very strongly in performance and image enhancers. Rich, the powerlifter at the start, he was saying he knew where to get it, he knew people in the gym, he could access it, but he wanted to go through his friend who he knew was on it, because he knew he could trust his friend, and if anything went wrong, he could go to his friend to remedy it. Whereas if you're just buying off a stranger, maybe you don't have those options. So we very much see the same kind of thing that we do with cannabis and MDMA. And a few people, so Liam Moyle, for example, did research in Plymouth a couple of years ago about people selling cannabis in student halls of residence. and she was saying how you move on from that social supply into a sort of minimally commercial supply, and then they would become known as a dealer within the hall, and then anybody who wanted to buy from them, even not just directly friends, they would come to them. And we see a similar thing in gyms, and Lee Monahan, who did, I suppose, the precursor of this research, he was researching hardcore bodybuilding gyms in South Wales and used performance enhancers there, and he found guys in the gym would just become known, usually the big bodybuilders, they would just become known as that's a guy who sells steroids. And we still see that in commercial type gyms in my research. So got a quote from Jim, the powerlifter, who says, "I just spoke to someone at the gym, found someone that was selling and gave him some money. Just sort of, what have you got, how much, and I'll have that and that." So very simple transaction, very clear. And likewise, Mark, the personal trainer, says he would say about 3/4 of the gym know which members deal it and which don't. And it's a common conversation in the changing room after a workout. He's a natural trainer, and everybody knows that he is. He makes that quite clear, and yet people just around him completely happy to talk about who they bought stuff from, how they're accessing it, what they're taking. And he says, and that's in a commercial type gym rather than a hardcore bodybuilding or powerlifting gym. People are very open, and everybody knows who's selling. So very readily available in gyms as well. And then online is, of course, the growing market. Novel psychoactive substances, of course, they made headlines. They were a big thing to be ordered online. And performance and image enhancers, we see a similar thing. Again, that's because we're dealing with that same grey market wherein they're not technically legal, but how illegal they are is questionable depending on the exact substance. And so in terms of accessing online, another powerlifter, Martin, he says, "I did a lot of research trawling bodybuilding forums, and you get a lot of information there. People just post where they get their stuff from, which sites are good, which aren't." And he says it's all sold as research chemicals. It's the same as with novel psychoactive substances, where they'll be sold as plant feeder or bath salts or something like this. Anything to kind of try and get around the law and say, well, we're saying it's not for human consumption, so we're not selling it for people to get high. Same thing with the performance and image enhancers, saying we're selling it for research, we're not selling it for people to use. And likewise, Rich was saying he used Boldenone, the horse steroid. Well, obviously that says not for human consumption, but the only people buying it are going to be using it. So very similar, a lot of overlap between the two markets we found. Likewise, Marius says he buys things online, and he says it's a lot like Amazon. You just go in the shop, add what you want to your basket, and you can pay through PayPal. There's no attempt to kind of, hide the transactions, make it difficult. It's very open, a very open market for, actually a technically illegal drug, Class C. But yeah. So next thing I wanted to cover is normalization, which obviously Parker is the primary writer on this area, relating to other drugs and drug use. Did a longitudinal study of teenagers, and then as they grew up, spoke to them 9 years later about their drug trying rates and what they had used and their views. And we see sort of a similar pattern emerging where performance enhancers seem to be becoming normalised. So his qualifications are access and availability, which of course I've just covered in relation to these. As you can tell, very easy to access, very readily available. And then recent and regular drug use, which doesn't necessarily apply to performance enhancers just because of the manner in which they're taken. So steroids are by necessity they're taken, you inject it every 3 days and you do it for a certain period of weeks. So it's not as easily comparable to drugs where maybe MDMA, you would just take it a couple of times a month and you would be a very frequent user. So I've not included that on my slides just because by definition in this market anybody who is using is going to be using long term and using regularly. But the other areas are drug trying rates in adolescents, because of course if the younger generation is using a lot more, then that indicates a pattern of normalization, and that will of course be expected to continue as they grow up, although not necessarily. Social accommodation of sensible drug use and cultural accommodation, which we'll come to. So obviously access we've already addressed. So the next thing is the drug trying rates in adolescence. And what we found is, Mark, the personal trainer, says from his perspective it goes down to as young as 16, and he says from the age of 18 to about 24, all the young guys who come to the gym and train, they're all thinking about it, they're all talking about it. Even the ones who aren't necessarily using themselves, they know where to get it, and they know what the effects are, and they know people who are using it. So it's very much a part of the young culture. These teenage guys in their early 20s, they're very aware of steroids, and he thinks a large proportion of them do use them. And likewise, JP said he started using when he was 18, 19. He's about 30 now, but he says a lot of young guys who are that sort of age, 18, 19, they come up to him and ask him about steroids, and he just tells them what he did when he was that age and tries to steer them in the right direction so they don't make the same mistakes he did. Because as we saw earlier, he didn't do any research himself, he just took what his friends were telling him. So now he's done the research, he's a bit older, now he tries to pass that on. But certainly it shows a lot of teenage guys, especially for the image side. That is primarily because those two are both in a commercial gym. Those aren't in hardcore powerlifting or bodybuilding gyms where they're competing. That's not to say it doesn't go on in those more competitive hardcore gyms. So Rich, the powerlifter, said he knew people who have been on since they were 14. I think that's the youngest age we've had come up. Guys who wanted to be competitive powerlifters or strongmen, and just knew from a very young age. One of them, it was because his brother was the Southwest strongest man at 22, and he was 8 years younger, he was 14, but he saw what his brother was achieving and just decided he was going to go on steroids and got them through his brother. So again, coming back to social supply. So yeah, as we can see, access and availability definitely fulfilled the criteria. Drug trying rates in adolescents, again, very, very clear that young guys are definitely using them, and there seems to be an increase compared to Lee Monahan's research, where it was just hardcore bodybuilders using, and occasionally they'd find a young guy would ask them and they would sell to him, but now it seems to be more, it's the young people who are making up the majority, and almost the powerlifters and bodybuilders, they're a separate subculture, and they're no longer the primary consumers. At least that's what the research seems to indicate qualitatively. So looking at social accommodation, as I said, with reference to JP, he got into it because all his friends were using it. And we see from a gym owner, Stephen, he was saying he thinks a lot of young men who are using steroids today, taking the age range 19, 20, 21, they don't see it as any different to buying a supplement off a shelf. And they've gotten so used to, you know, they started off, oh, I'll take protein shakes, and then I want to get bigger, I'll start taking creatine, start adding whatever else is on the range at GNC or even Tesco Asda. And then they just naturally progress to steroids because they're always wanting to go a bit further. And from his perspective, there's not this sharp distinction that there was when he was a young man 20 years ago, wherein it was this is legal, this isn't, and this is much more serious. He thinks it blends these days, and it's just the next step, and it's a natural progression. So he thinks a lot, there's been a big spread of young people using it. It's no longer just the very serious sportsmen. Now it's just casual gym use guys who want to get bigger or look better on the beach. And likewise, Rob, the chiropractor who I spoke to, he says from his perspective it seems quite mainstream now, and he compares it to cannabis when he was young in the 90s, how cannabis was becoming normalised, which is, of course, Parker's research, and he says it's just a slap on your wrist type thing. It's similar to underage drinking. If a guy's on steroids, maybe there's some kind of view that that's not right, but there's no real consequences, there's no real stigma attached to it. It's just maybe you shouldn't be doing that. And building on that, the wrestler Marius says he thinks that gear is the next weed. What's his quote? With cannabis becoming very mainstream, we had a debate just last month in the House of Commons about legalising it. Over in the States, they've legalised it in a lot of states for medical use, and in some places for just recreational use. And there's a lot of feeling cannabis is going to become fully legal very soon, even over here. And he's saying he thinks steroids are going to go the same way, looking at patterns of use amongst young people in gyms, how it's becoming the next culturally acceptable drug. And interestingly, when talking about perceptions of the wider society, in terms of the law enforcement particularly, and the stigmas attached, the guys are saying that there doesn't seem to be any opposition to them. So, as Marius noted, when buying online, he just says, if someone's blatantly selling it openly online, clearly it's not that big a deal. And likewise, Rich says he's had friends who are caught with an ounce of cannabis and they only got a verbal warning, and that's a Class B. If he's walking around with a Class C, who's really going to care? And it's very much the opinion of the guys within these subcultures that actually the wider society doesn't necessarily condemn these drugs, and they're just becoming more acceptable socially. The only thing that's I will pick up on there is Parker makes allowances for social acceptance of sensible drug use, and so drug abuse is not socially acceptable, and heroin is obviously the strongest one. Heroin and crack cocaine don't come up in Parker's research. And here we see a similar thing wherein people who are abusing drugs or performance enhancers are strongly criticised, but that actually becomes a part of acceptance of sensible drug use, because they're saying, okay, you're using it wrong, as opposed to just you're using it and this is the problem. So Steve, who's an old school bodybuilder, he's in his 50s, he was bodybuilding in the golden age, Arnold Schwarzenegger, been using steroids years. He says, nowadays it's like everyone wants to go on it without knowing anything. If someone comes up to me and asks for advice, then I'll tell them, but they don't bother. They just take it without learning about it. So he's very critical of people who don't do their research, don't put in the effort. But again, he uses it himself, he's very accepting of it. So again, it's this idea, sensible use accepted, abuse not accepted. And likewise, Marius says, if you're just that insecure that you want to be bigger than the next guy on the beach, then you shouldn't be touching it, because you're not going to do it right, you don't have the discipline, and you're just going to be a headline in the newspaper. So again, he's got no problems using it, he uses it himself for his sport, but he's just very critical of people who don't use it sensibly. So this, in fact, plays into what Parker was saying, social accommodation of sensible drug use, but critical of people who aren't using them sensibly. Excuse me. The next qualification in Parker's research, he said, what about the cultural acceptance of drug use? One of the examples he used was the Ali G show at the time in 2002. He said there's all these jokes about using cannabis. He's obviously always smoking it, and that was one of the points he made about how culturally acceptable cannabis has become. And likewise, we see with steroids specifically, but with performance enhancers as a whole, there seems to be an acceptance of the results, if not necessarily the use. So Harrison Pope is a psychiatrist in the United States. He does a really interesting piece where he takes a G.I. Joe figure from the 1970s, who's just a quite skinny, ordinary-looking body type. Then he takes one from the 1990s, who looks like Arnold Schwarzenegger, huge deltoids, huge pecs, ripped six-pack of abs, and says this is how the male body image perception has evolved over the years, and nowadays it's considered that men should have these very big, very ripped physiques, and that seems to have been compounded in recent years. So I actually gave this lecture earlier, and someone brought up the very good point that video games, you see the exact same thing. If you've got Gears of War or that type of game, guys with enormous deltoids, really muscular, like grizzled space marines, and that's just the norm, and people accept that as this is the cultural thing. So certainly the culture seems to be indicating that this steroid body type is what they want. And just in terms of the bodies people aspire to, celebrity bodies and whatever, Hollywood movies, you look at the superhero movies and you've got Thor and Captain America and whatever, these really big guys with these really overly muscled bodies. And likewise, we're seeing just culturally, so earlier in the year they were talking about the rise of the spornosexual to replace the metrosexual, which is more of a body type that's very ripped, very athletic, a cross between a sportsman's body type, athletic, and like what is seen in porn stars these days, these big muscle guys with six packs and so on. And that seemed to be becoming the predominant body type. And then we had a bit of I don't know if you call it a resurgence, but with the Rugby World Cup, suddenly people are saying, actually, what you really want is the rugby player's body. But again, these are very big, very broad guys. They might not be as ripped and the low body fat, but it's very clearly this very over-muscled masculine body type, and that's becoming kind of what's considered norm for young men. And finally, on cultural accommodation, Chris Bell made a documentary called Bigger, Stronger, Faster. Very good documentary on steroids and steroid use. He's the brother of one of the top powerlifters in the world. But just about everybody I spoke to in this research made some comment to me about, have you seen Bigger, Stronger, Faster? Or, the bit in Bigger, Stronger, Faster. So it's very mainstream within these subcultures specifically, that this film has gotten around and everybody is aware of the effects, which maybe they weren't back in the day when, with Arnold Schwarzenegger and so on. You could tell he was on steroids, but it wasn't quite so mainstream to be talking about the actual effects and the actual opinions on the steroids, whereas now that's what everyone's aware of. So the only area where there doesn't seem to be a cultural acceptance of steroids these days is this idea of roid rage. People who take steroids to become very aggressive and commit violent acts. The neuroscientist David Eagleman, I was reading his book recently, and he made a point about Chris Benoit, and he just said, he took steroids and he killed his family, then he killed himself. And he just casually said, that's what happens if you take testosterone. Because even a neuroscientist, that's just very much what we've heard about roid rage. That fits in completely with the cultural opinion. But Ross Coomer wrote a very good piece on this, and Lynn Monahan alludes to it in his work, that roid rage might actually just be a myth. It might just be the guys who are more inclined to be aggressive are going to be the guys who want to be bigger. So they think it's kind of a reverse correlation almost, and that roid rage isn't actually a thing. So I put this to some of the people I was interviewing, and Maris, the wrestler, brings up a recent case from last month. The trial was last month. The actual incident took place about a year ago. But he says 2 guys next to beat up some random person on the street. The newspaper article said both guys are gym users, but they deny that steroids had a part in their violent behaviour. And he says, just because they go to the gym, why did they have to try and tie in steroids? Why does it happen that no matter what the scenario is? And likewise, Jim Powerlifter comments on this, and he says, it always seems to come back to the steroids rather than the other drugs they've taken, and the fact they generally behave like assholes the majority of the time anyway. And so in this instance, this was outside a club, these guys who have been drinking, and yet the paper doesn't report on the alcohol causing the violence. It's, their gym users were steroids involved. And guys within the subculture are very kind of critical of this idea of the acceptance in mainstream culture of roid rage, which they're not so sure exists. So this seems to be the last barrier almost to cultural acceptance of performance enhancers, is the idea of roid rage, which is still such a mainstream thing, and perhaps isn't what the media makes it out to be. But I did get a few people dissent from this view who think that roid rage is a real issue. First was the chiropractor Rob, who quoted Steve, the old school bodybuilder, back to me because he hadn't agreed to talk about this bit with me. He didn't agree to cover roid rage, but Rob says that he said to him, anyone who says it doesn't make you angry, that it doesn't affect your mood, is completely lying. He's of the opinion that roid rage is real. And likewise, Rich, the powerlifter, he says he's more inclined to believe that roid rage is actually a thing, and he thinks the guys who want to deny it are just protecting their sport. They think, you're saying steroids are dangerous, and steroids are such a key part of bodybuilding and powerlifting, that therefore you're saying bodybuilding and powerlifting are bad things because they inherently use steroids. So there's some dissent. A few of the guys do think that roid rage is real, and Rich, his evidence was one time he got in a shouting match with his friend at the gym. Well, not even a shouting match, was just bellowing at him. His friend wasn't doing anything. And he said, I would never do that normally. I've only ever done that when I've been on a lot of steroids. And likewise, he's friends with Jim, who was previously talking about the guys, why don't they bring up the alcohol when they are bringing up the steroids? But he says, even Jim has similarly exploded that guy in the gym. And he's just such a calm person, so mellow all the time normally. When you speak to him, he says this is proof that roid rage is real. So it's interesting that there's kind of not an agreement between the groups, but it does seem to suggest, maybe at least with the culture and how the media portrays it, maybe they should be considering things like alcohol, or people who, who are starting fights. Maybe they're just more inclined to be starting fights, and the steroids helps them with that because it makes them stronger. But so that's kind of the suggestion of normalisation. As you can see, just about every qualification for normalisation has been fulfilled, except possibly on the culture side. We seem to be accepting the results of steroid use, the body types and so on, but perhaps the idea of the actual use themselves and the Roid Rage, that's still quite heavily criticised, and it's which way that's going to go, basically. Whether, because the body type's being completely normalised, actual use itself is going to become normalised, or whether we'll see a resurgence of this critique of steroids cause violence and therefore they should be banned. So interesting kind of focus on normalisation. So before we finish, I wanted to touch on possible career options, specifically selling these drugs. As of course we've heard about buying them, but from the supply side, what we have seen, one of the functions is an expanding network, much as Taylor and Potter found for club drugs, MDMA, and Liam Moore found for cannabis. We see the exact same thing with anabolic steroids. So Jim, who's a powerlifter and he also supplies people, he says people in your closest circle of friends know you're selling it, branching out from the social supply. Then they'll talk to other people who say, where'd you get that from? One thing leads to another, and all of a sudden you've got 30, maybe 40 people after things. And he just said the chain starts from there. So it literally just starts the social supply and just expands as more people become aware of it, goes to friends of friends and then their friends. And he said the operation as a whole at the busy times was taking about £2,500 a week. So he had quite a few people, and that's the net rather than the gross. So he had a lot of people buying from him. And he notes the busier times. That's because year round he has his core people, the powerlifters and bodybuilders who are always training. And then towards the summer he has a lot of these young guys who want to look really good for the beach. So his business actually picks up, and he deals more with this sort of stranger types, people he doesn't know very well then, because there's an entirely different group of people who want to start using at that time. And just to bring it back, there's also this idea of exploiting opportunities, which again we've seen somewhat with recreational drug use. But in the performance enhancing world, for example, Mark, the personal trainer, says he's known of members within the gym that go to a trainer just so that they can get the connection to performance enhancing drugs. People who either don't necessarily need a trainer because they already know what they're doing. He says football players and dancers go to a trainer who specifically trains for size, hypertrophy, bodybuilder types. And he says, well, they wouldn't be going to them for training advice. They're paying for the sessions, so they have access to the performance enhancers. And it seems to be within the commercial gyms, because there's not quite the same connections as we see in the hardcore gyms, where everyone knows he's using, I'll speak to him. It seems to be that the personal trainers fulfill that kind of role, and trainers are well aware of this. It's in their financial interests that they essentially know about steroids and that they have the connections, because if anybody in a commercial gym wants steroids, they're going to be the first port of call. So it's kind of those two sides, the expansion of social supply networks, and also the people who are just already in a position and realise there's money to be made here. And the next thing I wanted to talk about is the quality of product, which is an interesting one, because I'm going to come to legalization in a bit, but this is quite a key point before I do. It's the idea of making sure that people are getting the correct quality, so as a harm reduction thing. So Rich, the powerlifter, notes that currently with steroids, okay, they're quite mainstream, but they're still underground. They are technically a Class C drug. And he notes a lot of the local labs, if you just buy it locally, they're selling what he calls bathtub brew, where somebody buys powder from China and just mixes it up into the final product in their bathtub, which obviously is not going to be overly sterile and can cause abscesses and so on. And he notes that when you're making the compound, you need the steroid, alcohol, and an oil. And you could literally use any oil. You wouldn't, if you wanted to, you wouldn't necessarily go for proper pharmaceutical grade. And he says he's heard that people just buy vegetable oil off the shelf from Asda and they use that. And then people are obviously injecting this, which possibly not too healthy. So I did note this could be one of those pusher myths. Ross Coomer did some interesting research on this back in 2006, talking about heroin use, and he said he would speak to people who were cocaine dealers, and they would say, oh well, heroin dealers are really bad compared to us because they'll cut their heroin with brick dust, and this was just the cultural thing. All heroin is cut with these horrible things to hurt the customers, and he says that's a myth. When they've done the actual testing, that's not actually come up, and if you thought about it economically, it wouldn't make sense. So it is possible that applies here, but how Rich has explained it, you can see from a financial perspective why people who are buying in powder from China and they're just making the product up on the cheap so they can maximise profit. It's not disadvantaging them to buy a vegetable, or they're not going to lose customers. It does make economic sense. So I think in that instance, it's more likely to be believable. We are hoping to do some quantitative testing, so possibly later I'll find out what the truth of that is. But certainly that's the point, looking towards legalization and regulation, is from a harm reduction perspective, we don't really want that type of product on the street. So one of the users, JC, he's just a regular gym user, he says, if it's all controlled, how it's made and stuff, I don't see the problem why people shouldn't use it. And he's very much bringing up that point of, as long as we control the production, we can ensure it's a clean product. People are going to use it if they want to use it, which is what we're seeing. A huge number of people seem to be going on it despite it being this underground product. And he's saying maybe it's going to be safer if we just use pure product. And he also notes things like cigarettes are legal, alcohol's legal, but testosterone, which can improve your health, that's illegal. And that's an argument we see for recreational drugs, especially cannabis. People say, how can you legislate against cannabis when tobacco is legal? Tobacco is more harmful, it kills a lot more people. And again, same arguments apply to performance and image enhancers. There's a lot of overlap between the arguments in the different markets. And Marius, the wrestler, makes the point, he says, it's just a medication, it's like all the other shit you're taking, putting through your body. As long as you read the leaflet, you'll be fine. And again, this is coming back to, as long as you're using the pharma product, you're using the actual decent quality product, and you're not being an idiot. He's the one who was commenting on the two guys up in Exeter, who he sees as abusers, and talking about the guys who just want to look bigger than the next guy on the beach. So he's very critical of that, but he says, as long as you're following the actual instructions and you're using it how it should be used, why shouldn't people be using it? So that's a few very interesting arguments towards the legalization, and of course that's built on the normalization and cultural acceptance. So that's about me done. That's my research so far. So I hope you've enjoyed that. If anybody has any questions, thank you. Does anyone have any questions regarding anything? Or?
Were you surprised when you went in to try and meet all these people? How long did it take you to sort of get the people to give you interviews and whatnot?
It's been interesting actually. I've had a couple who were really eager, guys who I knew and were kind of friends, and I would say, oh, I'm actually writing on this now, and they'd say, great, let's sit down and do an interview. So a couple of powerlifters, because I was powerlifting before I injured myself, and but in a drug-free federation. I'll just throw that out there. But they were really eager to talk to me, but then other guys have been, I've sort of gone up to guys in the gym and I said, oh, would you be willing to talk to me about this? And they've literally said to me, oh, I don't know anything about that, or I'm not on steroids. And I'm thinking, you clearly are, I can see you are. You've got deltoids out here, I can see you're bloated with the acne, you're a classic steroid user, and they'll say, no, I don't know anything. So it's been quite awkward getting some response, but the few who I have had have been really interesting. I mean, as you've seen the kind of responses they've given me. So, yes?
You were talking about normalization and how kind of culturally and socially it's becoming a little bit more accepted. But at the same time, you just saying an example of how people might feel almost embarrassed to admit that they're using
it's the main thing I've seen. This is really interesting. I'll be in the gym training and people will just start talking about it. They'll just be like, oh, this is what I'm on, this is what I'm doing. As soon as you approach them even vaguely formally, guys who so I have the quotes from Big Steve, bodybuilder. All the quotes I had from him, that was just him talking to me in the gym. As soon as I said to him, can I do an interview? He was like, I don't know anything about it. And I'm like,
well, you've spoken to me about it before. You've actually told me that you do it, and you've told me all this about it. So it seems to be, I think it's more an aversion to academics than anything else. And as Mark was saying, he's a natural trainer. He's very well known as a natural trainer. But people just freely talked about it around him in the gym. So it's, again, there is still some stigma, and there might be some embarrassment, but it just seems to be more they're aware that I'm going to be reporting what I find. Whereas if I'm just standing around lifting weights, people will be stood in the squat rack next to me going, oh yeah, well I'm on trend, and you know. So yeah, it is weird, but yeah, there's definitely something to it that they don't want to.
I've got a follow-up to that, because it's a good question actually. I've got a follow-up to that. Do you think then, and I should have asked you this, Luke, but I've only just thought of it, so do you think that there's, if you're using it as part of a sport, so what I'm trying to say is there a difference between the people that use it as part of their sport and the people that use it as image enhancers? So I guess what I'm trying to say, my sort of hypothesis is that if you're just using it to make yourself look bigger on the beach, you don't really care too much about who knows if you're using it. If you're using it for sport, you might be a little bit reluctant to say, I'm using it.
In a way, it almost seems the opposite, but I think that's just because the sportsmen I've been talking to are the ones who are in the sports where you can use it. So wrestler, MMA fighter, a bunch of powerlifters, and a bodybuilder. Well, the bodybuilder actually was less inclined to do a formal interview. But these guys, I suppose because I was powerlifting, they know that I know there's a lot of steroid use. So they're happy to see me. They've seen I've won a couple of competitions, and they go, okay, here's a guy who knows about the scene. So they're very happy to talk to me. Whereas guys who are on the image side. So a funny example was there was a guy going on, and he was constantly talking about how he was natural, and he was going, well, of course, as a natural teen, as a natural lifter. And I'm thinking, you're more or less giving away to me that you're not natural by your constant insistence that you are natural. It's very. I don't quite know where the division is between who's happy to talk and who isn't. It's hard to say, but I've actually found sportsmen within the sports where it's accepted are very happy to talk, probably more so than anyone else. And I guess it's kind of on a scale, the guys who are just doing it for image, I suspect it's the ones who are more embarrassed that they've had to use it for the image. They don't talk, whereas some of the others are just more open and just like, yeah, I did it.
Yeah, so interesting.
A lot of their like fitness models and things, they're not allowed to say they use it as well.
Yeah.
Sponsorships and things like that.
So
that could be a huge thing as well.
That was, of course, that was covered in Bigger, Stronger, Faster, the documentary, and he was talking to a fitness model who was advertising, I don't know, some creatine product or something, and he says, well, don't you feel bad about telling people this is what I take and I have this body? And the fitness model says, well, I never say that's the only thing I take. If people infer that that's the only thing I take, then that's their fault. So, but yeah, definitely. A couple of the personal trainers I tried to speak to, who I know for a fact are on, they wouldn't, and they seem to be the main ones who turn it down. And I think it's, as you've said, it's the financial thing. It's part of their business. They seem to be the least inclined to speak to me. So yeah.
Would you say the people who use it for image have less knowledge about how to use it in sort of the right way with like all the training, opposed to the people who use it for performance?
Yeah, as a general rule, it seems to be guys who are using it for image, literally it's just their friends are using something, they say, what are you using? And they jump on the same thing. And it seems to just be a circle of someone once has got on it without really knowing what they're doing, but they've seen results because they've gotten bigger. They've gone, oh, I must be doing it right. And then they've just passed on to their friend who's told their friend, and so on. But that's almost a pattern I think it must have taken. Whereas the guys on the sports side, I didn't quote them, but Martin, one of the powerlifters, he literally spent months just sat down, just researching, making sure he went through every piece of research. Marius said for every piece of research he says finding one thing he specifically seeks out, saying the opposite. Very much the guys involved in sports. The only one who didn't do that was Rich, who I quoted I think probably the most in there. But that's because his best friend is a chemist and is also using and has done all the research as well. So he says, I just ask him if I have any questions. But he seems to be the only one of the sportsmen who didn't go out of his way to do proper research. It seems to be very much, it's the image guys who are just very, very casual with it. Yes?
Apart apart from the woman who used it for injury repair, did you encounter any other women who used it?
Yeah, that's the thing. I think again, it's the culture. So the men, it's very much accepted, especially in powerlifting and bodybuilding. All the men are known to be on it, and I think perhaps there's still more of a stigma with women using it. I go online and I see anonymous posts by women who say that they use it, but sort of in the gyms, they're a lot less likely, or it could just be standard interaction. Maybe it's the way I act. I'm more likely to bring out those confessions from men, whereas women are less inclined. So there's probably a couple of things you could think of, but certainly it does seem women are less likely to use them. But again, that's because I think women are less likely to be involved in bodybuilding and powerlifting. And I suspect if you went to the top levels of both of those sports, there would be similar levels of use to men. But I've got no research to back that up, unfortunately.
Sorry, Mark, carry on.
What's your view on DNP?
DNP?
Because obviously, like, it's not a steroid, but it's the most, like, caused most deaths, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's...
Sort of body image.
It does seem to be rather dangerous. The main problem with DNP is, as I was saying about the legalization, not knowing, purities not knowing, what seems to happen with DNP is it's people who have gone online looking to buy a fat burner, and they've probably tried not very good products before. They've probably tried like Thermopures or Grenades or whatever, and they go, okay, that didn't work at the normal dose, so I had to take 4 times dose.
Yeah.
I'll get DNP, I'll have to take this at a much higher dose than it says, and of course it kills them, because it is a legitimate thing. So, DNP is a metabolic poison. That's what it is. It is very dangerous, but on the other hand, I think it's primarily the reason it's dangerous is just it's not known about, it's not researched. It's a lot like heroin. People are overdosing because they don't know the purity of what they're using. And I think it's the same thing. If people could readily get DNP and they were told specifically how to calculate it and told you can't go over this, which you do see on the bodybuilding forums when you go online, they are very careful to say this will kill you if you mess around with it. I think if that message always went out with it, it would do less damage. But I mean, it is harmful to use anyway because it's I think it gives you cataracts or something. It messes with your eyes somehow.
I don't know. I just know I get on from it last year. It took like 10 times the dosage or something.
And that's the problem. DNP, it's one of these ones that very scaled to your body weight. So if you're already
females,
it tends to be females and especially ones who are just trying to get thinner. If you weigh 50 kilograms and you look up online and a bodybuilder who weighs 120 says, oh, this is what I took, and you go, great, that's what works. That's going to kill you. So, yeah. But certainly, talking about the harms, I mean, the research into steroids is very hard to find instances of it actually killing people, actually doing serious harm. There's one bodybuilder who everyone always brings up as the great case of he died of steroids. But again, he's a guy competing on stage, dehydrating himself down when he's already 3% body fat, completely drying himself out of any fluid. And you go, how much of that was steroids and how much is just bodybuilding? Is very dangerous in and of itself, even without steroids. And likewise, as I said, David Eagleman brings up Chris Benoit, and people are saying, was that actually the steroids, or was that he'd had multiple concussions, he was addicted to painkillers? There's all kinds of factors at play. But DNP seems to be the one where you can absolutely say, yes, that does kill people. So,
I was just going to ask cost, because we're going to do something on costs and stuff next week or the week after next. So what's the cost of this? What does it? I mean, the price. I don't mean the cost. What's the price?
But it depends who you're buying from and all sorts. Trying to think of a way of phrasing this nicely. I might just use the actual words.
Just say it.
Okay, so Jim, I was asking him, this was in a text as like a follow-up to the interview, and I said to him, how do you work out pricing? And he goes, well, how I price D-Bol is, I price it based on how much of a cunt you are. And he said, so to you it'd be 100 quid. And I was like, cheers. He goes, his standard price is normally 25 to 30 a pot.
Yeah.
If he doesn't like the person, he goes as high as 70.
Right.
He says if the guy doesn't know what he's doing, if he clearly isn't that familiar with steroids, he'll just jack the price right up. So, but yeah, a lot of the stuff. So standard price is testosterone between about 25 25 to 40 a vial, depending, and if you buy in bulk, obviously it scales.
Yeah.
Growth hormone was kind of all over the shop. I mean, I think Rich said he got some for £90, and then Rose said she got one lot was 300, and then Steve said the reason he didn't use growth hormone was because it was about 800 quid a kit.
Yeah.
So whether Rich bought legit stuff or whether he just had placebo effect, I don't know. He does have a vial, so if we ever get testing sorted out, we'll be able to see.
If we get the test sorted out, we will see what's in it. But I suppose the purpose of that really, Luke, is that next week, I think, or the week after, coming when it is exactly, we're going to talk about the price and cost. So the price you pay, the monetary value, and then the associated cost in terms of health and so on and so forth. And I was just thinking about how much money you would have to spend in order to achieve what you wanted to do.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's interesting. So Marius, the wrestler, he was saying he runs a low dose of testosterone and then a bit higher on Boldenone normally. He did try tren for a while, he confessed. But he says when he's doing his testosterone and Boldenone, it's actually relatively cheap because he just wants to repair, he just wants to recover so he can keep wrestling and keep doing his MMA fights.
Yeah.
I think, what did he say? He said he ran 500 milligrams of testosterone a week, which would be 2 millilitres, so one vial would last him 5 weeks.
Yeah.
So that's 30 quid for 5 weeks, £6 a week.
£6 a week, yeah.
Yeah, and then Boldenone I think would come to about the same kind of cost. So he's spending maybe £12 a week. But then guys like Steve, the bodybuilder, he's obviously using a lot more. And these young guys, maybe they're paying more per tablet. So even if they're only using testosterone and D-bol, maybe they're paying double the price that they otherwise would be.
Yeah.
So, but it doesn't seem to be that expensive to use it. Just
so I suppose what I'm trying to get at is it's manageable on the budget. You wouldn't necessarily have to commit crime to buy it.
No, I mean, JC made an interesting point because he wanted it for his back, which had been completely damaged, and he was one of the ones I mainly talked to about repair. And he was saying when he factors in, he goes to a chiropractor every 3 weeks. He has to see a physiotherapist. He's constantly buying cod liver oil, ibuprofen, and these things. He says, I think it would be cheaper for me to just go on steroids. So, you had a question?
He's saying, because obviously it's not readily available, with that guy saying, like, if you're a bit twat or you don't really know what you're doing, and they're like, bump the price, do you think that's to like defer people using it as well, though?
In a way, because he was one of the two who was talking about he doesn't like how, there's the reports of the guys in the papers who just act like idiots. So I think in a way it is. And also, it's just basic economics, price discrimination, isn't it? It's targeted pricing. He doesn't know what he's doing, therefore I know he doesn't know what a regular price would be, so I can make a bit more money here. So something that would be 25 or 30, if he was selling it to someone he knows well, he can charge 70 and get away with it, so why wouldn't he? So I think you could be right to an extent about, it is trying to discourage them, but also I think it's just pure, I don't know if you'd call it greed, it could be entrepreneurship. But
And then there's an essay in itself, what's the difference?